They say the best revenge wears a smile and signs the check. I was standing in the lobby of the Harrington Grand, holding a glass of sparkling water I hadn't touched, wearing a dress my sister-in-law would later describe to her friends as something you'd find on a clearance rack at a department store that was going out of business. She said it loud enough for 12 people to hear. She made sure of that. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the dress had been custom-made in a private atelier in Milan, that it had taken 6 weeks to finish, that the fabric alone cost more than the monthly mortgage on the house my brother had just bought with money he'd borrowed from our parents, and that I owned the building we were all standing in. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Claire. I'm 31 years old, and for most of my adult life, my family has treated me like a very polite inconvenience. Not with cruelty, exactly, more with a particular kind of dismissal that's harder to name, the kind where you're invited to every holiday dinner, but seated at the end of the table near the kitchen, where the conversation doesn't naturally include you, where your achievements are received with a small nod and immediately followed by a longer conversation about someone else's. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, the youngest of 3. My brother Daniel is 6 years older than me, confident in the way that men who have never really failed tend to be. My sister Patricia is 4 years older, sharp and polished, the kind of woman who has an opinion about your haircut before she says hello. Our parents, Robert and Judith, are good people in the way that people can be good and still cause damage, not through malice, but through the quiet, consistent communication that one child simply matters more. Daniel was the golden one. Star athlete, business degree, the son who called home every Sunday. Patricia was the achiever, law school, a firm in Cincinnati, a husband named Gregory, who wore the same 3 blazers on rotation and spoke about real estate at every family gathering as though he'd invented the concept of property. And then there was me, the one who had dropped out of architecture school after 2 years, who had moved to Chicago without a clear plan, who called home irregularly, and always seemed, to my family, to be just on the edge of something that never quite materialized. They weren't wrong that something was materializing, they were just wrong about what it was. When I was 22 and living in a 1-bedroom apartment in Wicker Park with a drafting table taking up most of the floor space, I started a small design consultancy with a woman named Rose, who I'd met in a coffee shop when we both reached for the same architecture journal. Rose was 10 years older than me, had spent a decade working for firms that put her name on nothing, and was ready to bet on herself. So was I. We called the company Stratum Design, rented a desk in a shared workspace, and started pitching to anyone who would listen. I won't make it sound easy, because it wasn't. There were 18 months where I was doing freelance drafting at night to cover rent, surviving on coffee, and the specific determination of someone who has decided they would rather fail loudly than succeed quietly on someone else's terms. My parents knew I was doing something with buildings, but the details never quite landed for them. Design consultancy wasn't a thing they had a frame for. It wasn't a firm with a name they recognized. It wasn't a salary they could translate into respectability. So when I came home for Christmas, they would ask how things were going, and I would say fine, and they would move on to asking Daniel about his expansion plans for his auto dealership chain, or Patricia about her most recent case, and I would sit at the end of the table and eat my turkey and think about the project we'd just been awarded in Denver, or the hotel client in Nashville who had come back to us for their 3rd renovation, and I would say nothing. I said nothing for 8 years. By the time my brother's engagement to Vanessa Cho was announced, Stratum Design had become something my 22-year-old self would not have fully believed. We had 34 employees. We had completed projects in 11 states. Rose had won 2 national design awards, and I had quietly been named on a list of emerging architects in the country by a journal my family had never heard of. We had a contract with a hospitality group based in Atlanta, the Harrington Group, that had started 5 years earlier with a lobby renovation in Nashville and had grown into something much larger, including the Harrington Grand in Cincinnati. The hotel had been built on the bones of a 1920s department store in downtown Cincinnati, 6 blocks from Patricia's law firm. It had taken 2 years to complete. I had driven through Cincinnati a dozen times during the renovation process, had once passed my sister on the street while she was walking to lunch, and had said a quick hello before ducking into a car that was taking me to a site meeting. She had mentioned it at Thanksgiving. "Claire, I saw you in Cincinnati. What were you doing there?" And I had said, "Work stuff." And she had said, "Oh," and that had been the entire conversation. The Harrington Grand opened in March. It was reviewed in the Cincinnati Enquirer, the Chicago Tribune, and Architectural Digest. It won an award from the Ohio chapter of the American Institute of Architects 4 months after opening. My name was in the credits. Rose had framed the AD piece and hung it in our office. My family had not mentioned it once. I had assumed, somewhere in the back of my mind, that by the time Daniel's wedding came around, scheduled for October, at the Harrington Grand, because Vanessa had seen it in a magazine and fallen in love with it, which I found privately hilarious, someone would have put the pieces together. Patricia was a lawyer. My parents were not unintelligent people. The name Stratum Design was on a small bronze plaque in the lobby. But the thing about being invisible for long enough is that people stop looking. They already know the story of you. You're the one who dropped out, who moved away, who is vague about what she does. The facts don't rearrange themselves around new information. The story stays the same. So when I flew into Cincinnati the Thursday before the wedding and checked into a room on the 7th floor and walked through the lobby I had spent 2 years redesigning, running my hand along the restored terrazzo floor we had fought to preserve against the developer's preference for polished concrete, no one in my family knew I was there. No one knew I had stayed in this hotel 6 times during construction. No one knew that the warm bronze of the sconces in the grand ballroom, the room where Daniel and Vanessa's reception would be held, had been my choice, selected from 47 samples over 3 weeks of deliberation. The rehearsal dinner was Friday evening, at a restaurant 2 blocks away. I arrived on time, wearing a dark green dress that I had bought on a trip to Florence 2 years earlier. I had always loved that dress. It was simple and well-made and cost more than most people would imagine. It made no announcements. It just fit. Vanessa, my soon-to-be sister-in-law, was everything my brother had always been drawn to, beautiful in a way she was clearly aware of, socially polished, with a laugh that she deployed strategically. She came from a family in Columbus with money, the kind of money that expresses itself in understatement rather than display, and she had arranged the wedding with the precision of someone who understood that an event is also a statement. She greeted me warmly enough at the rehearsal dinner. She kissed my cheek and said it was so good to finally spend real time together, and she introduced me to her parents and 2 of her bridesmaids, and then her attention shifted, and I was left standing near the bar holding a glass of Riesling, talking to Daniel's college friend Marcus, who asked me twice what I did and didn't retain the answer either time. It was at dinner, seated across from Vanessa's mother and one of her aunts, that the first comment came. Vanessa's mother, a tall woman named Linda who wore pearls and smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes, had looked at my dress with the brief, assessing glance of someone who has been evaluating clothing as social currency for 60 years, and I had watched the calculation happen on her face in real time. "You know," Linda said, directing it at her sister but not lowering her voice enough to make it private, "I told Vanessa to book a stylist for the wedding party, but apparently not everyone takes that kind of thing seriously." Her sister made a small sound of agreement. I picked up my wine glass and said nothing. Vanessa, to her credit or discredit, had heard it. She laughed lightly and said, "Mom, stop," and moved the conversation forward, and that was that. But I saw my mother at the other end of the table absorb the exchange, and I saw the particular expression that crossed her face, not quite embarrassment, not quite agreement, but something in between that I had been seeing my whole life and had never been able to name precisely. The wedding day itself was beautiful in the way that expensive, well-planned events are beautiful. The light in the grand ballroom was exactly what I had intended when I placed those sconces, warm and slightly amber, turning everyone's skin to gold. The ceremony was in the hotel's courtyard, which we had designed around the original iron fountain that had been part of the 1920s building, and I stood in the second row and watched my brother get married, and felt genuinely happy for him in the uncomplicated way that is only possible when you have long ago stopped needing something from a person. The reception began. The music was good. The food was excellent. The chef at the Harrington Grand had come from a restaurant in New York that I had eaten at twice, specifically because I wanted to know what his food felt like before recommending him to the hotel's management. I was standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the courtyard. talking with a woman named Diane who turned out to be Vanessa's former college roommate and was very funny about it, when Vanessa appeared at my elbow with 3 of her bridesmaids and her mother. "Claire," she said, "I've been meaning to ask, what is it exactly that you do? Daniel is always so vague about it." "I'm an architect," I said. "I run a design firm in Chicago. We specialize in adaptive reuse, taking older buildings and renovating them for new purposes." "Oh, how interesting," Linda said, in the tone of someone for whom it was not interesting. One of the bridesmaids, a woman named Kelsey with very straight hair and the confidence of someone whose opinions have rarely been challenged, looked at my dress and then at me and then said, with a small smile, "Did you design this building?" "Yes," I said. There was a pause. "This building?" Kelsey said. "This building." Another pause. Linda looked at the sconces. One of the other bridesmaids looked at the floor. Vanessa's expression shifted through several things: quickly surprise, recalculation, something approaching embarrassment before settling on a controlled brightness. "Well," she said, "it's absolutely stunning. Daniel never mentioned that." "Daniel didn't know," I said. "He didn't," Vanessa stopped. "You're telling me your brother planned his wedding in a building his sister designed and didn't know?" "I didn't tell my family," I said. "It didn't come up." Linda had gone quiet. She was still looking at the sconces. "The terrazzo floor is original," I said to no one in particular. 1924. We spent 4 months restoring it. There were 17 people who wanted to tear it out. Diane, who had been listening to this whole exchange with visible delight, said, "I love this so much," quietly into her champagne glass. Vanessa excused herself shortly after that. I watched her find Daniel near the bar and say something to him, and I watched my brother's face do the same rapid recalculation that Vanessa's had done, and then he looked across the room at me with an expression I didn't have a name for yet. He came over 20 minutes later. "Claire," he said. "Danielle, Vanessa says you designed this building." "I did." "The whole thing?" "My firm did. I was the lead architect." He looked around the room, really looked, maybe for the first time, at the ceiling detail we had restored from old photographs, at the bar, which had been designed around a single piece of black walnut we'd sourced from a mill in Kentucky, at the courtyard, fountain visible through the windows, lit now in the evening dark. "It's incredible," he said quietly. "I know," I said without arrogance, "just as a fact. Why didn't you tell us?" I took a moment before I answered, because I wanted the answer to be true and not just satisfying, because I knew you'd ask that, and I wanted to have a real answer. He waited. "I stopped telling you things," I said, "because telling you things didn't change anything. Dad still talked about your dealership for 20 minutes after I mentioned winning an award. Mom still asked Patricia about her cases right after I said we'd landed a hotel in Nashville. Not because you're bad people. Just because you already knew who I was, and new information didn't update the picture." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "That's fair," he said finally. "I know it is. I'm sorry. I know you are." He hugged me then. A real one. The kind that we hadn't had since we were kids. And I let him. My parents found out the way information tends to travel at weddings through the rapid, low-frequency current of people telling each other things in corners. By the time I went to find them an hour later, they already knew the broad outline. My father looked like a man who had been handed a fact he didn't know how to file. My mother had been crying, which surprised me until I realized she wasn't crying about the building. "I didn't know you were unhappy," she said. "I wasn't unhappy," I said. "I was just quiet." "Those aren't the same thing?" "Not always." She took my hand and held it, and I let her. What I want to say about Vanessa is that she surprised me. I had written her off, in the way you do with people whose first impression is a strategically deployed condescension, but she came and found me late in the evening, after the speeches, when the dancing had started and most people were not paying attention to individual conversations, and she said, without preamble, "I want to apologize for my mother, and for the rehearsal dinner, and for the fact that Daniel apparently has been entirely oblivious for 10 years, which I intend to address at length on our honeymoon." I laughed. It was genuine. "For what it's worth," she said, looking around the ballroom, "I cried when I first saw this room in a magazine. I didn't know you made it. I just knew it was the most beautiful room I'd ever seen, and I wanted to get married in it." She paused. "That means something to me, that it was yours." "It means something to me too," I said. Linda came to find me before the end of the night. She was still wearing her pearls. She stood in front of me for a moment, and I gave her the grace of not making it more complicated than it needed to be. "The floor is extraordinary," she said, looking down at the terrazzo. "I've been walking on it all night." 1,924, I said. "They don't make it like that anymore." She nodded, and that was all, and it was enough. I flew back to Chicago on Sunday morning. Rose had already seen a photo from the wedding on my sister's social media. Patricia, to her credit, had posted a long caption about the building that I suspected had required some research on her part, and had tagged Stratum Design, and had written at the end, "My little sister made this." I should have said that sooner. It had 412 likes by the time I landed. Rose texted me a single line, "Did you know this was going to happen?" I texted back, "I knew something was." There's a version of this story where I end it with a lesson about patience, or about proving people wrong, or about the quiet dignity of working in private for a decade and letting the results speak. And those things are all true, in their way. I did work in private. The results did speak. There is something to be said for all of that. But the thing I actually think about, when I think about that night, is not the moment Kelsey's expression changed, or Daniel looking at the ceiling like he was seeing it for the first time, or even my mother holding my hand. I think about the terrazzo floor. I think about the 17 people who wanted to tear it out because it was old and impractical and didn't fit the developer's vision of what the space could be. I think about the 4 months we spent restoring it, the specialists we brought in from Philadelphia, the documentation process, the arguments and site meetings, Rose and I eating takeout on the subfloor at 10 o'clock at night, looking at photographs from 1,924, and then at what we'd managed to bring back. I think about Linda standing on that floor in her pearls and saying it was extraordinary. She was right. It is. Not because I made it, I didn't make it. It was already there, underneath everything, waiting. I just knew it was worth saving. I just refused to let anyone convince me otherwise. That's the only thing I've ever really known how to do. See what's already there. Hold on to it until the moment is right. Wait for the room to go quiet and let the thing speak for itself. The floor did the rest.